Thank you for joining us for another opportunity of fellowship with This Is My Story, testimonies that move the soul.
All right. Well, thank you, Deborah, for your warm and generous introduction. And it's my pleasure, with the assistance of Sharon, my wife, to make this presentation. I've done this presentation a few times and some other things like it, but always because my wife happens to be technically savvy and I am not, but with her assistance and advice, here we go. And this is the protest and the progress overview. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, Protest and Progress is the name of the book that was published by Andrews Press in June of 2018, and which has had a warm reception in the Black sector of the Adventist Church, and to some degree in the general Caucasian and other sectors as well. And what Deborah has asked me to do today, and my wife and I are weekly participants in sharing the story. I've told her so many times that I appreciate what she's doing, as so many of you do who are regular listeners. And I think that the Lord is using her, and I'm happy to be able to contribute a bit with this presentation. The book is all about the journey of Black Seventh-day Adventists in the North American division since the very inception of the church. And as you will see in just a moment with the slides that we have, it seeks to detail the position of the church, the general church, the Seventh-day Adventist denomination, the General Conference, and to a greater degree as time goes by, or as time went by from our Genesis, the North American division, and how the Black constituency grew and how its present configuration was necessitated. And I hope that as you listen, you'll have an appetite to buy the book. This is not a sales talk, because I don't do that, especially on the Sabbath. But I hope enough will be said so that if you don't have it, you'll be able to fill in the blanks and to get a lot of more detail by reading the book itself. It was printed, or is printed, because it's now going into the third or fourth edition or printing. They've had to replenish on a number of occasions by our own press, Andrews University Press. And if you don't have it, there are a lot of details, especially in the appendices, that make up over 300 pages, 315 pages of history of our people and how we've related. So I invite you not just to listen to the presentation, but hopefully to get it. You can get it from Amazon, is what a lot of people are doing, because that seems to be the most easy and convenient way, and Amazon will respond right away. All right, let's go to the presentation, and I hope you'll have some questions when we're done. And by the way, as I move through the presentation, I will stop occasionally and ask if you have questions. But if at the very end you still have others, we'll take them. Now, our first slide simply, again, gives you the title, Black Seventh-day Adventist Leadership and the Push for Parity. Now, that word parity is loaded. It means not only equality, but also equity. And that'll become very apparent as we talk about the fourth protests. There are four very clearly defined protests made by Black Seventh-day Adventists as they sought to position themselves appropriately within the Seventh-day Adventist Church in the North American division. And in the final protest, you see where equity in particular becomes a vital concern. So again, Protests in Progress, name of the book, is an overview of the four major attempts of Black Seventh-day Adventists in the North American division to achieve parity in both membership and mission. The next slide will give to you a historical background that really says it all. Everything else that's going to follow in the next several slides is rooted in what you're looking at right here. On the left-hand side, you see 5 historical periods that have been defined from slavery in 1619, and that's the date we generally begin, although there are historians who say there were slaves before then. And mind you, of the many millions of slaves who were taken out of Africa, only 500,000 were deposited in America. All the rest were deposited in islands of the Caribbean and in South America. So America, the US, didn't get as many slaves as I thought before I began my studies in this area, about 500,000. And by the end of slavery in 1865, there were 4 million slaves, all gathered in the southern part of the United States. And then after that, there was what is called Southern Recovery. After the end of slavery in 1865, and this is important to notice, the politicians in the South who were very angry and hostile to the North, to the Union tribes and territories that had defeated the Southern Army, these Southern politicians began a recovery. And that recovery didn't bring back slavery, but in 1896, it established separate but equal. Separate but equal said that Blacks cannot go to white gatherings, that Blacks cannot drink at white fountains, that Blacks cannot eat in white restaurants or sleep in white hotels. In other words, separate but equal said that there are 2 different nations living in this territory, one white and one black, and that they must be separate. There could be no marriage, there could be no association. It was a slam dunk position of the government against any mingling of the races. And remember that, because that has a lot to do with what the church went through. All right, after that second period, and it lasted from 1896 to 1954. And mind you, I was 24 years of age in 1954, having been born in 1930. So, and some of you were around before 1954, and you know what it means or what it meant to be a separate nation legally, to be legally separated in the territory of the so-called United States. But separate but equal lasted from 1896 to 1954. And then the Civil Rights Movement came in 1954, and by that time, the nation had loosened its grip, and separate but equal was annulled. And from 1954 to 1968, the Civil Rights Movement was all about trying to get the nation to live up to the new policy of desegregation. And then from 1968, which was the end of the Civil Rights Movement officially, that is de facto on paper and by law, but it wasn't the end. It was the end de jure, pardon me, but not de facto, so that by de jure, by law, all of the government positions said no more separate but equal. Everybody is desegregated. De facto, it didn't happen. De facto, it didn't happen in much of the country, particularly in the South. And it did not happen in the church either very easily, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let's look at the right-hand side of the slide. And let me point out that during slavery, there were no Seventh-day Adventists. The Seventh-day Adventist took its name in 1963, and it was in 1965 when the church was legally registered. So only the last 2 years could there have been something called the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But during that time, what I like to call pre-Adventism existed, and this was Millerism. William Miller got his call in 1831. And from 1831 until 1842, when Ellen White had her first visions, and from 1842 till 1848, when we had our first Sabbath conferences, the Millerites, there were no Seventh-day Adventists because Adventism hadn't been brought in yet, but the Millerites and their churches, or the churches of Millerism, fought vigorously against slavery. So before there was a Seventh-day Adventist church, the pre-Adventist pioneers spoke out, and we have a number of documents written by those involved in the Millerism movement, including Ellen White, who was a staunch enemy of slavery, that chastised the government and that fought against all of the inhumanity that slavery was about. And then that continued during the Southern Recovery, as the church had to position itself. The government had said, you can't have these Black people worshiping with white people. And as Blacks were beginning to become members, and that started in 1844 with a few, and later in the 1870s, by the 1870s, there were a handful of Blacks in the South, one or two in the South, and a handful in the North. And from 1865 until 1896, there was just the little beginnings, the primary beginnings. And by 1896, there were approximately 50 living Black Seventh-day Adventists. And by 1900, there is the recording that says that there were 100 Black Seventh-day Adventists in 1900. And the early pioneers, even though the government said Blacks could not go to church where whites were, the early pioneers tried, and many of them, like the first president of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, John Byington, who was connected with the Underground Railroad, if you can believe that. But the man who was elected president in 1887 or 1885 was himself a participant in the Underground Railroad. So what Miller and his people did was continued during this second period, although the government said you couldn't have the mixture of the races. Then in the third period, things changed. In the third period, where they're separate but equal was still going so strong, in fact, begun in 1896 and lasted to 1954, 58 years. During that period, there was a shift from what the early pioneers did before the church was organized and what the church did and in its early years with the first president. And the brethren decided that since the government said, we can't work together, we can't sleep, we can't live, we can't eat, we can't fraternize, you Black folks just have to understand that And while we'll accept you into the church, you can't be a part of our conference committees. You can't be leaders in the church. In fact, you can't really worship with us. We'll come over and help you. So we didn't have leaders, Black leaders, many. We had some in the early part of that period. And it wasn't until the 1920s that there was a come to Jesus meeting, I guess we can call it that, and we'll show you that a little later on, where the Blacks began to protest vigorously and talk about the fact that since we can't be a part of your structure based upon government regulations, maybe we need our own structure. Maybe we need our own structure, and we'll detail that. Then during the Civil Rights Movement, the church still held on to gospel expediency. And as I said, many of us who lived during that time met it. I could give you a number of experiences that I had personally when members of my church, wherever I was pastoring during that time, and I was in Florida and Georgia and Detroit, Michigan, and later on moved to the Southern Union and the ministerial department. We who were active then met the resistance that gospel expediency ordained. Gospel expediency said, during separate but equal, you can't come in. And gospel expediency said, after separate but equal was annulled, well, we don't know, because if you come to our schools, if you go to our churches, white people won't come in, so you better stay out. But the staying out meant that our leaders were not paid the same amount of money. Our leaders were not on the necessary power groups, or the committees had made policies and established practices, and they suffered. And it was in this era, in that third historical part of the chart on the right-hand side, that Black conferences were begun. And the brethren said, well, if we can't get in, we better have our own. And when I joined in the ministry in 1952, the Black conferences were about 6 years old. They had just really started 6 or 7 years before I became a pastor. And I'll detail some of that in a moment. And finally, from 1968 until 2000, and that's as far as the book really tries to detail, there was a considered push on the part of Black leaders who had by now established their own conferences, or sister conferences, let's say, parallel conferences, to not only have Black conferences and Black coordinators on the West Coast, where the West Coast, the Pacific Union, where most of us are on today, live, said, we don't want to get Black conferences. We just want to make these state conferences that exist do like they should. We just want to do better where we are. We don't need to have special Black leadership to do the work of the gospel. And this is all of the overview that I'd like for you to understand, and with which I want you to be acquainted before we go to the very next slide, which will begin to detail the first of the protests, and that is the push for Black conferences, which began in that third view. Do you have any questions? I'm going to go back to that first slide for just a moment. And I want to know, do you have any questions on this historical overview of what the government was doing and how the church was relating in these periods of government administration? Any questions?
So, Dr. Rock, I have a quick question. Do you see the trend that you've outlined? Do you see that it is consistent with other Protestant faiths at that time?
Absolutely. The church, the one church that history records was consistent from the very beginning and never changed was the Quaker Church. The Quakers never changed. They fought slavery, and all during the Southern recovery, they fought that, and they never changed. The Church of the Brethren, the Quakers. And the Other standard churches, along with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, gave in to gospel expediency and separate but equal. But when separate but equal was annulled in 1954, at the end of that third period on the left-hand side, these churches said, okay, the government says no more segregation, no more separate but equal, and blacks can come to our schools and come to our churches. But the Adventist church didn't do that right away. It took the Adventist church until 1965 to say all of our schools and churches must be open. So the Adventist church was late in speaking out, and it was one of the last, if not the last, majorly recognized denomination to change its position, and it held on to gospel expediency. We had to wrestle for position and wrestle for participation, and this is what produced the energies that brought about Black conferences. But the parallel is very clear when you consider how the Quakers did. Now, the Quakers have never become a major denomination, and maybe this has something to do with it. Maybe their position held them back during those days. And that's something the historians will have to research. But as far as I know, they're the only church that was consistent all the way through, and the others did change during that third period when separate but equal was going on. Well, they didn't change during that period as much as once the edict was given in 1954 and separate but equal was annulled, the Catholic Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, all along, all of them, all the major churches put out their statements and said no more segregation. The one major church that held back until 1965, which was 7 years later, finally said no more segregation in our church. But even though they said it, the churches and the schools didn't rush out and do it. It took many years for it to become effective. And it finally did, we can honestly say. And today, I don't know of any segregation in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, none. Now, I know of some people who may be segregationists. And even today, white Adventism is mainly evangelical in terms of its social regard. And it's the evangelical church or system of churches that put Trump in office. And most white Adventists are Fox News believers.
Have mercy.
They are Republicans.
Have
So
mercy.
even though we have changed in terms of our statements, still the battle goes on today, but I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. But
Surely.
this is how it developed.
Thank you for that, Dr. Rock. There's a question here that's been posted on the chat. It says, what about the understanding that our pioneer, Ellen G. White, is the one who recommended to have separate Black and white churches? And then
That's a good question. It is true. When Ellen White went over to Australia in the early 1890s, she had already said it was a terrible thing for whites not to admit Blacks. In other words, she was like the Quakers. She was fighting against separate but equal. She fought against slavery. She fought against separate but equal. But when she came back in the late 1890s from Australia, separate but equal had been put into operation, and she saw how the Klan was hanging and murdering and how hard it was for the freed African slaves to subsist and exist. She said, look, given what's going on in the United States, it's better for whites to work for the whites and Blacks to work for the Blacks until the Lord shows us a better way. That's her statement in volume 9. Until the Lord, she didn't say this is to go on forever. but she saw the hostility. She knew that white Adventism could not prosper if it allowed blacks into their schools and hospitals and churches. So she took the proper practical view of the matter. I think we have to admit the church would not have grown if they had let us in, and we have to feel sorry for them. But my position has always been that we can't blame them too much for what they did during Separate but Equal. We have to be merciful. But once Separate but Equal was annulled in 1954, from then on, our church, in my opinion, sinned because they refused to get rid of gospel expediency and continued to shut us out of their churches and their schools and their hospitals. And it wasn't until decades later in the 80s and 90s that, even though we spoke up in 65, that the church really began to function understandably in the way it should have.
And so I want to acknowledge two other comments. I believe that it's Elder Meunier. He mentions in the chat that the Blacks were allowed in token numbers in academies and colleges in the early 50s. And then there's another comment, perhaps you will elaborate a little bit further. They believe that the comment from Ellen G. White is perhaps what spearheaded, or at least was an impetus for setting or charting the course for Black and white conferences.
Yes, it is true that even in the 30s, there were one or two Blacks permitted here and there, but they suffered. They suffered. They could only room with Blacks. They had to eat at a Black table. They couldn't be the valedictorians. They suffered. And again, I remember in the 40s when my mother moved in 1941 from Harlem out to LA. I remember, even as a youngster, 11, 12, 13, 14, hearing of the horrible stories that were going on about Blacks at the academies around in the state of California. And in 1936, F.L. Peterson was the first Black graduate from Pacific Union College, and there were one or two people there, but majorly speaking, across the country, that was the way it is. There were only one or two or three or four, and they were segregated in their studies, in their social life, and were not permitted the common courtesies that the average student would get. And for me, in 1961, while we're here, I had an issue when I was pastoring in Miami in 1961, and Hialeah Hospital, I was pastor of the church, wouldn't let me in. In 1965 and 67 and 68, I tried to get our three daughters into a school in Atlanta. And I was working in the Southern Union and the Ministerial Association, and the church would not allow our children into the school, or at least the first time we asked, they said no. And I think this was by now, trying to get my years straight, by now it was late 1960s, and the pastor said, we will not let your children in this year. And that was 69 or 70, and we won't let them in next year either. That was the way it was.
And it needs to be pointed out, Dr. Rock, that at that time, you were a pastor working for the church.
Well, no, I said I was working in the Southern Union. I was a union departmental leader of the Southern Union, which takes in 8, I believe, different states. So that is true. But the second question was about
token representation in our academies.
Token representation. What did you say? I'm sorry.
Meunier, was that you?
All right. Pastor Meunier wanted to know about the token representation, but somebody else had a question. There was a second comment or question.
There was a comment that indicated that they believe that Ellen G. White and
Oh,
her
yeah. Yeah.
understanding that was the
All right.
impetus.
Let me respond to that. Ellen G. White said, it's better for blacks, and this was around 1900 when she returned from Australia. You remember, before she went, she chastised the brethren and said, stop it. You should let blacks come in spite of what the government said. But when she came back, that was before separate but equal became a law. But when she came back, separate but equal was the law, and things were worsening. The Klan was hanging blacks, not one at a time, but in groups. And it was not safe in the South in particular, but even in the North. And there wasn't much going on in the West. The West had not really been developed as yet. There now weren't enough blacks in the West to produce a problem. But in the South and in the North and the Northwest or the Middle West, Ellen White's advice was, since the nation was hanging on to pseudo-slavery, quasi-slavery with separate but equal, and things were getting worse and worse, really, after separate but equal became the law, she said, no, it's better for blacks to work with blacks and whites to work with whites until the Lord shows us a better way. So that was not endorsing slavery. It wasn't even endorsing separate but equal. It was a common sense approach for the mission of the church, and understanding that the only way blacks were going to be able to do their work and whites were going to be able to do their work is that each had leaders who could do indigenous service, especially in the black community.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Rock. There are two others that follow. Perhaps you would like to tackle those now.
Yes, please. That's what I'd like.
Elder Menyer's remark indicated the tokens in the academies and colleges. That was followed by a remark by Renee Scruggs that said not only in the 50s, but also tokens in the 70s in terms of Michigan and their practice there. That spearheaded a remark that said, has the church ever repented of the gospel expedient sin?
All right. Yes, Renee Scruggs is correct, and Brother Pastor Renee Menyer is correct. Tokenism continued, even after separate but equal was annulled. And that is where the church missed the boat. Once the government said separate but equal is done, the church would have done well to jump in full steam and said, hallelujah, we don't have to be careful. We just must go forward. And no matter what anybody says, we're going to do this together. But they didn't do it. They didn't do it. And that produced a lot of issues. And in some regrets, some respects, we still have individuals, not the church. The church has repudiated separate but equal. And the church has, in the North American division, we're talking about North America, we're not talking about the whole world church. The church has had, on a number of occasions, produced statements that has spoken regretfully about what has happened. Now, I don't know that the North American division has ever had a clear-cut and widely disseminated statement that said, we regret gospel expediency. I've never read that, never heard of that position being stated, but it has, on a number of occasions, expressed sincere regret and apologies for what these earlier leaders did in terms of refusing to let us in. All right, I'm going to move on to the first of the Black reaction to all this. Now you see the background. The first reaction was the push for full participation from 1898, right after separate but equal, to 1928, blacks pushed and said, we want in. Even though separate but equal was still there, they pushed and said, well, that's what the government says, but we're Christians and we want in. And that didn't happen. And we'll talk about that in a minute. The next push, they said, well, if we can't get in, we need our own conferences. When our own, I mean parallel conferences, conferences that are run by blacks who understand what's going on in the black community. Because until 1944, when black conferences were established, what we had was white leadership trying to run the work in the black community. And it wasn't happening very well. By 1900, we had 100 blacks. By 1908, there were 1,000 blacks. By 1909, there were 1,000. By 1918, there were 3,500. And blacks were growing, the membership was growing, but black pastors felt that things could grow much faster in their communities. This wasn't a push to be big shots. This wasn't a push to have blacks with their feet on the table, on the desk, reared back as some sort of great leaders. This was a push for indigenous leadership that came out of the black community, that knew what the black community needed. And since we didn't have that leadership without white conferences or without blacks, since blacks were still tied up in the white conferences in lesser positions, these folks said, we want to do it. The Lord wants us to get the gospel to the people. We know what we think our people need. In fact, we can't even get people to join our church because they think our church is segregated. They know our church is segregated, and they know our church is functioning under gospel expediency, and they know that our church is honoring separate but equal. We want an organization to work for our people that's going to be more effective. And that happened, and we'll show you how that organization came about. Then from 1969 to 1980, we had the third protest. This is when black leaders said, hey, we've got over 100,000 members now, and we've got enough to have black unions. Instead of having 8 or 9 conferences that they later developed to be scattered in several unions around the country, why not bring the black conferences, local conferences together? And that will enhance our ability for lateral mobility as well as vertical mobility. We'll be able to talk to each other in a more immediate and intimate manner, and that'll help our work. And that push failed. So number one protest did a lot of good. They didn't get conferences that they were seeking, but the very fact that they started to plea and to talk produced energies that spilled over to the second protest, and that push for black conferences led to a development that brought us to black union appeal, and that was denied. The church felt that it would be better to keep all these local conferences in the standard unions that we have, in the state unions, and then, or the state conference with the state conferences in the standard unions. And after that, there was the fourth protest for equitable retirement, and that itself is an exciting development that did succeed. So this is the flow of how we pushed. And I say how, I wasn't in the first one, but I was in the second one. At least I was old enough to understand it. I didn't participate, but I was very much a part of the third push. And I rejoiced to see the last one, even though I really wasn't in it. By then, I was about to retire. That's the picture. Now, here is the first of the full participation or the first push, which was the push for full participation from 1898 to 1928. The next slide gives you an overview of how Black Adventists suffered under gospel expediency, which didn't end until 1954. So this was the way it was. It was just a series of denials: membership in churches, schools, institutions, medical, hospitals, employment and conference, and of course, the lack of proper treatment and equal pay and positioning. Next slide. The consequences were dire. Discouragement of Black members. We lost hundreds and thousands of members who just couldn't take it. While, of course, the government was doing what it did, we had leaders, as you know, Booker T. Washington and other great leaders during this time who were trying to get their people on a better footing in the government. And we had members of our churches who fought against separate but equal and gospel expediency. And they left the church because they were refused association. And they saw how our early leaders suffered, one of whom was Pastor Green, William Green, who was elected as the first secretary of the regional department. In 1909, the Adventist Church began the Black department. Wasn't regional, wasn't even Black. It was called the Colored Department in 1909. And guess what? They put in 3 different white leaders to staff that department. And as a result, there was protest by the Black members. And in 1919, or 18, pardon me, William Green was made the secretary of the regional department, and he had to cover the whole Black work all over the South. By then, we had a lot of churches propping up in Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama and Texas, and some even out in Kansas area. And of course, they were up in New England, and he had to cover everything. And his office was in Detroit, whereas his appointment was with the General Conference in Washington, about DC, about 700 miles away. And he suffered and finally died after an itinerary that took him all around the country, except for the West Coast. And many feel that his death in 1929 was because this one Black man trying to cover all the work as an advisor had to sleep on trains and eat out of a paper bag, and there weren't hotels where he could stay. He had to do what he could to survive, and it is believed that his death in 1928 was strictly because he was thoroughly exhausted. And as a result of what our brethren had to do, and I say brethren because, you know, we didn't have female pastors back there. Our brethren had to suffer was not only discouragement and loss of members, but actually it was loss of physical energy and resources and a waste of talent, and even a waste, we feel, of life in some instances. And as the next slide seeks to demonstrate, the protests that Blacks had, the recognized protests, were begun in 1898 when C.M. McKinney, the first Black ordained pastor, was ordained at a camp meeting in Nashville. And they told him and his people who had come to see him ordained that they couldn't sit with the whites at that camp pavilion. And Kinney and his people left, but they protested and said, if this is the way you're going to treat us, and this was just 2 years after Separate but Equal had been established, perhaps one day we'll have to get our own conferences. That was way back in 1898, which was some 46, almost 50 years before these conferences were begun. And then in 1899, Louis Sheaf who was an outstanding, stellar preacher. He had been a lawyer before he became an Adventist, who knew Ellen White and all the other leaders, himself protested, and he spoke, and the book will give to you. You can read them, letters that these men wrote and statements that they made protesting the fact that they were Adventists but could not be a part of decision making for the Black work. And that included a physician, an outstanding physician, James Howard, who himself protested, and his letters are in the book, to Ellen White, and J.K. Humphrey, the most vociferous of all the protesters, perhaps, who in 1928, after several appeals to the church leadership during the teens and the earlier 20s, took at 600 or more members from the nearly 1,000 membership at Ephesus in New York City and established his own Sabbath-keeping denomination. And it's interesting to note, I must pause to say, that all during this time, the Methodists and the blacks who were Methodists and Baptists had either already established their denominations or were establishing them. But these Black leaders, some of them tried to get a Black Adventist church, but they failed, whereas as of today, there were the beginning of the Black denominations, the Black conventions, and the Methodists, the phases of Methodists that are Black, and Pentecostals. But the Blacks who were protesting never succeeded in getting enough Blacks to go along with them to establish an all Black denomination. Next slide. But they attempted. And the others who defected, whose history is recorded in the book, include John and Charles Manns in Savannah, Georgia, Sheaf himself, who repented and came back into the church in 1916 after earlier protests, and joined in with the Manns brothers. And of course, as I mentioned, Humphrey, and there was Anna Bontemps, who was a part of the Harlem Renaissance, who taught at Harlem Academy just before I became a student there, and who later taught at Oakwood, who had taught at Oakwood, and who was the best and I think the most celebrated of all Black academics of his era as a part of the Harlem Renaissance, but who left in 1935 because as a result of the strike at Oakwood, when the students in the year 1931-1932 school year said, we don't want any more white leaders at Oakwood, we want a Black president. And that's how Elder Moran became the first president of, they called him the president even then, before they were called directors. But he became the first president at Oakwood, which still was not a senior college. And he was blamed, Bontemps, because the student had this riot and he was teaching there. And the brethren, white brethren, thought he had started the students and fueled their energies that made them riot. And he had to leave Oakwood, and he left the church eventually and became librarian at Fisk University. And he died a Lutheran, I believe a Catholic or a Lutheran, yes, a Lutheran, in the early 70s, as I recall. But these men were giants in terms of preaching the three angels message, but they just couldn't take it. And they kept pushing and pushing for full inclusion and for the ability to work in the Black communities, but when they couldn't get it done, they left. All right. The first real appeal in this regard was in 1909. The second one was in 1918, when Green, whom I've already mentioned, was appointed, and they were turned down and failed and told never to come back again. In fact, let me mention, my former father-in-law, my late father-in-law, F.L. Peterson, who was the second president of Oakwood from 1945 to 1954, was at the meeting in 1929 when they made their appeal for a conference. And the brethren said, no, you cannot have black conferences, and don't mention it again till Jesus comes. So these early attempts failed. And because they failed, our black leadership from 1929, when that appeal was turned down, to 1944, had to work and do the best they could. And remember, by this time, separate but equal had not been annulled, but just as abolitionism shook the foundations of slavery, just go back to that last slide, just as abolitionism shook the foundation of slavery. There were years before slavery was ended, during which abolitionists wrote and spoke and preached, white and black, and loosened the foundation so that finally slavery could be annulled in the United States. So in the United States, before separate but equal was annulled in 1954, a lot of things happened between 1929 and 1944 that helped to loosen the concrete foundation of separate but equal, which finally was broken in 1954. And during this time, our black leaders continued to do their best. And while that was going on, the government was beginning to loosen the grip with separate but equal, and 10 years later, it happened. But now, as the next slide will show you, the appeal in 29 failed, but in 1943, Elder McElhaney, who was president of the General Conference, not the North American Division, the General Conference, called all of the black leaders together who'd been pushing and asking and turned down, and said, we think you ought to have your own conferences. A lot of people think that black conferences were begun simply because black leaders got angry or were trying to get even and were doing negative things, but that didn't happen. What happened was the General Conference president called the brethren together and said, you ought to have your conferences. And that was partially, not only because of what was going on in the government at that time, as the foundation of separate but equal was being loosened, but also things were happening in the church. And among those things that were happening in the church was the growth of the Adventist black membership. By 1944, we had almost 18,000 members. We had just 100 in 1900. We had just 3,500 in 1918. But now, in 1944, we had 18,000 members, and our black leadership was strong. We had strong black preachers and wonderful leadership at Oakwood. And the brethren felt if we could only have indigenous leadership in our communities all across the country, we would be able to spread the gospel better. And in 1943, Lucille Byrd, and here's that incident, and it too is covered in the book. Lucille Byrd, a very fair-skinned black woman who was taken from New York down to the Washington Adventist Hospital and refused and told that they had to go across town to the black hospital because they couldn't take a black person in Washington, D.C. at the Adventist hospital. And this stirred up such a reaction, especially in the D.C. area. And I must say, that reaction was staunchly supported by women. It wasn't by preachers even. This was a lay thing. The layman at the now DuPont church, called the Ephesus church then. And well, DuPont, I suppose had been named by then or were about to be named, responded with such an explosion that it was a shot across the bow, and the brethren were shaken up by the letters that they wrote and the sermons that some of the ministers began to preach. And as a result of this ripple of defection and dissent by our layperson, joined in by ministry, our General Conference leadership was shaken, and it helped to produce the vibes that led to their bringing the Black leaders together and saying, now let's go and let's get our churches. And so they called the brethren together, and some of the Black brothers who were there said, no, we don't want to have any Black conferences. We want to stay right here, and we love you, brethren, and you're just trying to get rid of us, but no, we're not going to leave. Other brethren said, oh no, all this time we've been fighting for the resources and the freedom to preach and to organize and to do what we have to do to get equal pay and equal resources to push the gospel in our communities. Now our white brethren have brought us together, and they're asking us to do this. And in the book, you'll read about it. I have the names in the book. I have the committee minutes. I have what the General Conference president said. I have what the General Conference secretary said. What the Black brethren said. Some of them are named. I don't put the names of all those who were refusing, because some of their descendants are still living. I didn't want to embarrass anybody. But the book details it in ways that you will, I think, enjoy as you read through this very exciting history. And the result of that meeting, when the General Conference president called the brethren together and said, now you must get your conferences, please get your conferences. They voted yes. But the West Coast representatives did not go along or did not see that it was necessary to do on the West Coast. Well, let me stop and explain. Things were different in California and Arizona. Number one, there were not many Blacks living out this way in 1944. We just begun to migrate to the West. That's number one. There weren't a lot of Black citizens. Number two, in 1944, there were 1,500 Black members. That's the total membership on the West Coast in 1944. Right now, I think it's approaching, 70, 65, maybe 1,000. But then there were 1,500. And that number, well, they could have gotten a conference. But that number included people who grew up on the West Coast, and they had never had a lot of hangings and a lot of insurrections like the ordeal, the massacre in Tulsa in 1921, all the riots that had gone on in the South and the West. That had not happened on the West Coast. And these West Coast Black people were not familiar with all there had been some bad things, but there was no approaching the intensity of animosity in the South. So they didn't really feel the need. And number two, the West Coast Blacks who had come out here, who had migrated out here, many of them had left the South where all those things were going on, and they didn't want to hear about it anymore. They just wanted to come out here and live peacefully. So there weren't a lot of energies for Black conferences for those reasons. And there are other reasons having to do with the environment. My mother brought us out here in 1941, and we thought we were in glory. When I left Harlem and came out to Los Angeles with palm trees and oranges growing on my neighbor's trees and avocados and all the sunshine and the snow in the mountains and the weather, the West Coast people weren't bothered about having a Black conference, so they didn't get involved. But in the rest of the country, where the situation was different, the environment suggested it, conferences were organized. And as you'll see in the slides that now are before you, the slide, you had Lake Region in 1945, and then Allegheny East, which later divided East and West. West Allegheny was in 1967, but Northeastern was the third up in New York, Allegheny in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania, and in those states around that area, South Atlantic, with several states in Georgia and Carolinas, South Central with Alabama, Mississippi, and Kentucky, Tennessee, in that area, Southwest with Texas and parts of Louisiana and so forth, central states with the middle part of the U.S. and Nebraska, and then Allegheny West, which was the other part of what Allegheny East was originally, and then Southeastern, which was the divide from South Atlantic, which now includes the state of Florida. So this is how the 9 conferences and when they came about. Now, before I go to the push of Black unions, questions are in order about the history so far. I'm going to the conclusion with these last 2 protests, but you've heard a lot, and I'm going to pause for your questions.
And so, Dr. Rock, there was a comment that was made that said, and there wasn't slavery in 1865 after emancipation, hence perhaps why the reception and interpretation at that time, because slavery wasn't after 1865.
I'm not sure I understand. No, it wasn't slavery, but it was a Southern recovery, which was in some cases worse than slavery. In some cases, it was worse than slavery because you had these slaves. They ate they ate the leftovers of the master's table, but they could also eat some of the food they were harvesting. But once they went out from slavery, they had no lands of their own. They were dispossessed. They didn't have anywhere to live. They just had the gunny sacks on their backs. And they had the anger of the white slaves who'd been defeated in the Civil War, who were determined to wipe them out. And they were being hung right and left. Separate but equal was, in many cases, as bad as and even worse than slavery, although the beautiful part, at least they were free and they could try, and they did, and we recovered, but it was a horrific, bloody, evil, heinous era in American history.
There were 2 other comments that followed regarding some of those same sentiments. Cheryl Bedney Moore says that's what Juneteenth was all about.
Right.
As
Correct.
well as Bobby Andrews, who gave a reminder, Juneteenth. And of course, we recognize that was made a holiday by our president having signed that and making it official. Those are the comments that I have here in the chat. Are there any other comments or questions regarding what has been given thus far? I think we're good, Dr. Rock.
All right. Then we'll go to the push for Black unions. So in here we are. The push for Black unions from 1969 to 1980. Let's look at the first slide that introduces us to some of the facts. The Black membership grew from 1900 to 1969, and the social events, the Black membership growth from 1960 to 1969 continued in a very, very rapid manner to some 70,000 and more, as indicated earlier. And the social events in the country were also moving in directions which suggested that these local conferences needed more structural, adhesive, and connective energies than they had. And the other event or the other reason that Black unions were pushed is, as I've indication, the R, as I've indication, the refusal or the, if not refusal, the delay of the church to accept the repeal of separate but equal. And as I mentioned, the definitive statement was in 1965. There was a tentative statement in 1961, 7 years after the repeal. The church issued a statement that said, "We believe in the brotherhood of all men." And that was nice, but it didn't say tear down these walls of segregation in the church. That didn't happen till 1965, 11 years later. The 7-year statement was a tentative agreement that God loves everybody and we're all brothers and sisters, but it didn't say anything that would lead or that sounded like a demand and a vote and a policy and a practice that every college would do away with quotas, that every church would allow Black membership, and that every hospital would accept Black patients. Our first daughter was born in 1965, Cheryl, in the state of Florida, in the city of Winter Park. And when my wife looked in the phone book and found and kept calling till she found an Adventist doctor, he was white, but he told her that he would take her, but she had to come around to the back door. She refused to do that and looked again and found a Catholic doctor who said, "Of course, I'll accept you." And there was no mention of a back door. And that's who delivered her child. In 1961, I had a condition that I needed treated immediately, a skin condition, and tried to get into Hialeah Hospital in Miami where we were pastoring. And they told me, no, they didn't take Black people. And I could go on with other incidents that we had to face. But the church made its statement in 65 and things began to change. It just changed too slowly because the church did not insist. And Black unions reacted, were a reaction to that. And as the next slide shows, the push continued from 69 to 70 when meetings were held, to 76 when finally we were told we don't need any Black unions. All the conferences, all these Black conferences should stay in the unions where they're located. And of course, that leads us to a very interesting overview here of the primary proponents for Black unions and the primary dissenters. Among the Blacks, and the interesting thing is that some Blacks fought against Black unions, and I have their names, they're all my friends. Only one of them is living now, and that's Charles Bradford, and who is my mother's youngest brother, my uncle. But the people who push for Black unions, we call them the integrationists. They're the ones who believe that integration should continue and that integration meant that everybody should try to be together physically in terms of and philosophically in terms of the work of God. So we should all be in the same unions. And this included my good friend Earl Canson, whose son Earl Jr. is still with us and a good preacher and pastor and friend, and Frank Hale, who was my predecessor at Oakwood, who was in the camp against Black unions. He later changed when he went to the Black church in Columbus, Ohio. But those who were for it were called self-determinationists. They felt that the black conferences had grown to the point where they should be clustered together and it would be better. And this included Elder Bradford, who at the time was president of the Lake the Lake Region Conference. He was president of the Lake Region Conference at the time in 1969. And Earl Cleveland, who was at the General Conference, and Elder Dudley, who was president of the South Central Conference. And all these are my friends. I loved Elder Banfield, his family, his son, the wonderful Warren Jr., his wife, Deanie, and all of the others. Let me get that name right. Jerry, pardon me. Don't tell her I said that. Jerry, used to be Deanie. Jerry, and so this is the way it was. We had my good friends. I saw them and sat and I collected what they wrote. And that's really what the book is all about in this section of the book. It was about how they thought, and they all fought well. And my mother was with the integrationists. Those of you who knew Eva Bradford Rock, a funny thing was, it was really a great thing in a way. She was working with the integrationists while her son, Calvin, and her brother, who was the conference president, Charles, were working for the self-determinationists. So read it in the book. I won't go into all of that, but that's an interesting sideline, and maybe not a sideline, but an interesting view that you'd like to read. All right, the next slides show how all these fellows position themselves in terms of principle, means, benefits, and risk. Everyone had a different view. And let me go. For instance, Elder Canson, he wrote about unity, and he said you get that by association. Association brings togetherness. But the risk, as the book will show, was tokenism, because they bring you into, if you're not careful, the one black or the first black and not all the rest. And as blacks come in for this association, our white members leave. We call it white flight. So how do you get association if they're not there? That was the big question that we had for him. But let me give you another one. There was Cleveland, we're right under him. And Cleveland had the opposite view. Now, his principle was practicality. He said, well, yeah, we want unity, but let's be practical. We're not having it. When we come, they leave. So why should we continue to push for that kind of integration? Just get desegregation and self-determination. And his means for his practical thing was accommodation. Just give us what we need, accommodate us. We want to run this. It's a little different from what we've been doing as a church, but give us the accommodation. And his benefit was self-determination. You could get better and faster and more prolific and more obvious benefits if you have self-determination, because you know better what the black community needs. But the risk of Cleveland's position was separatism. So you get this self-determination, so you're going to have separate units, and that's the risk. And if you study this list, each of these people had good things to mention, but there were risks, bad eventualities, unless they could be cared for in some way. With Banfield, there was a matter of cultural sharing, and I have his papers, and they're good. But what he risked in our position, my own idea of the matter, was political emasculation. So you have cultural enhancement, but if you don't have political power, then you always have the tyranny of numbers when you're voting. So each of these is that way, and you can study it in the book.
So,
there were a lot of significant. Did I hear somebody with a question?
It was me.
All right.
There was a comment that was made. I wanted to mention it before you got too far away from the topic. They mentioned that they felt that the time came where they were willing to accept the conferences and so forth, because now the individuals were bringing in money. The African American community that was able to contribute. It was because of the money they brought in with their tithe and their offerings.
No, that wasn't the reason. That was not the reason. It is true that they had $500,000 when they were organized in 1944. It was just $500,000 tithe and offerings. And the Black church in North America was 9% of the total North American division membership. Today, it's 33%. Today it's 33%, but it was 9% then with $500,000. Today is 33% with $320 million in tithes and offering. So there is a money benefit, but it is the benefit that the Black conferences have now, not what they had then. And what they had now is being majorly plowed into the Black work. So finances were never, as I understand it, a variable in this consideration.
In addition to that, you've mentioned that the church seemed to not have us as a priority, and yet and still, Ellen G. White was able to garner some individuals to agree with her in the acquisition of Oakwood, those grounds. Would you elaborate a little bit on who those individuals were and why they were willing to separate themselves from the general thinking at that time and agree to purchase this land?
I'm not familiar with any dispute about the establishment of Oakwood in 1896. Mm-hmm. No, Ellen White encouraged the brethren to go and look at this property, and for $6,000, they bought this acreage. But I'm not familiar that there was a dissent among the white brethren.
And was the church the entity that purchased the land, or was it individuals?
The church. The General Conference bought the property for the benefit of the children of the recently freed slaves. And the book will tell you that my grandmother and the mother of Charles Bradford, Elder Bradford, and Deborah's great-grandmother was one of the original 16 students at Oakwood in 1896. So Deborah, thank you for asking the question. It gives me the opportunity to talk about your great-grandmother. All right, was that why you asked me? No. I don't. I know, just teasing. But the fact is that Etta Bradford, who was born in 1881, was there as a student in 1896. And our family has been a part of Oakwood every year since then, in some way or the other that I know of. But this takes us up, and I want to get on to the retirement. Then we can go back and have questions in general. But let me pause. Is there any other question about the organization of Black conferences, why the West Coast does not have them, and why there was a push for unions, and why it was defeated? Any questions about these phases?
I have no questions. I want to thank you, Elder Rock, for an excellent presentation. What you have done for me, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Elder Michael Ashley, president and founder of Touch of Love Ministries. When I founded Touch of Love back in 1988, Elder Canson was my chairman, and I had people on my board like W.D. Felder and Elvius Thompson and William Eileen, a lot of the young Turks from the northeastern area. And I didn't understand until now a lot of the real heated debates that was going on and how adamant they were about wanting to have a Black conference out here, and some of the language that I heard. And once again, as you mentioned about Elder Canson, he was always very smooth and very calm and very quiet, and he wanted everybody to stay together. But I understand now more about why William Eileen and even Helvius and many others, after that big fight we had out here, many of them had to leave. They wanted to leave and get out of here. And then they wanted to go back to an area where they were more familiar with the Black conferences and stuff.
The relation was This is a building that you can have and use for 100 years, and after that 100 years, whoever gave it to you will renew it.
Call yourself
Deborah?
Okay, I think we have a few different individuals
Okay,
speaking.
let Michael finish, then we'll hear the others.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, I knew that I was hearing things like, well, the West Coast was never part of the Black movement. When you look at the marches for our liberation as Black people, as you said, Elder Rock, we were too much laid back, I guess, out here. I'm originally from the Midwest, Milwaukee, but moving to California, I was hit with all of this. But it wasn't until today, listening to your presentation. I wish that others had known. When I saw your name on today, I thought you were just going to be preaching like you did a few weeks ago on one of the other podcasts. But if I had known that you were going to be sharing this type of deep history, I would have loved to have invited others on, because this has really been rich. And I just want to thank you so much for all this history, because it has helped me now to have a little better understanding why my chairman, Elder Canson, and many of those other great friends of mine that was on my board were so strongly rooted and grounded in their stance, in their position. So I just want to say thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome, and I'm glad you mentioned William Felder, because we had Timothy Nixon, and we had Anthony Pascal, we had Hobdy, Cleveland Hobdy.
Oh God.
And we had others. We had a lot of young men who in the 80s, in particular, the 80s and 90s, were struggling for a Black conference on the West Coast. But you had other people like my mother, my dear mother of sacred memory, and my dear friend, Major White, my buddy, Major, and Earl. They're a little older than I, but they were my big brothers. They were adamantly against it. And their position was, and you can't say, I had this debate with my mama. Now, I was in trouble debating my mama because she could outthink and outtalk me. It was a wise woman. But their thing was, and my mother was so Black, they were all Black at heart. They were Black at heart, but they just felt that, and many of them, like Major and Earl, had gone to PUC and they had white friends and they were used to that community, and they felt that they could take care of the Black community and stay in the white work, not the white work because we're all in the same work, but they could have the same configuration. So what was established was the present system, which is a system of coordinator. You don't have a president of a Black conference, but you have a regional coordinator in every conference.
Right.
And that regional coordinator, Michael, has a Black office and a Black secretary and a Black budget and a Black camp meeting and a Black workers meeting and a Black everything else.
Yes, sir.
So you don't call it the president, but you even have Black presidents now.
Oh yeah.
And my president is Black in Nevada, Utah. My president, Elder Brown, is, I call him one of my boys. All the preachers who graduated from Oakwood when I was there, I call them my boys.
Yeah.
Brown is one of my boys. He's the president. Then you got the president of the union. The president of the Pacific Union is a Black man, Ricardo Graham.
Northern California.
And then you have the president of Northern California, another one of my boys.
Yeah.
So you see, it's working in a different way, and I think if Earl and Major and my mom and even others who fought for it, like those you mentioned, including Dr. Partridge and Brother James and these people who fought for conferences out here, it didn't happen. I think they would be proud if they were alive, because it's not happening as a conference, but these men are doing a good job, and we praise God for that. And we can argue as to whether it would be better if there were conferences. But hey, we thank God for what's being done, and I think they would be very proud if they were alive today. My mother, when I was chairing the board at Loma Linda, and my mother was in her final years, and I would go down from Las Vegas, where I live, and take her to Loma Linda for hospital treatment, to the hospital. 2 or 3 times we sat down in the hospital, and my mother looked around and said, "Wait a minute, where are the black nurses in this place? I don't see any black secretaries."
Oh boy.
And I would start going under the couch and say, "Oh, Mama, don't say that. Please don't say that." And she would say, "We need black people out here. My son is the chairman of this board. What's the matter with you people?"
Oh yeah.
So it wasn't that they weren't black. Major, Earl, the rest, they're black. They were black, but they had another way of trying to solve the problem. And we have to give it to them for the fight they put up and for the progress that has been made.
The blood.
I heard some other voices. Anybody else want to comment on this?
Yeah, there are several comments that have been noted in the chat. The first one is, Pastor Rock, where did you fall on each, or where do you fall perhaps on each of these areas? That's a loaded question.
On each of these areas?
Perhaps it's the
I'm not
Cleveland, Dr. Cleveland, and Elder Earl Campson.
It's the chart that you put up.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. My name is not in that grid that I showed you. It's in the book. My name is not in the grid. I was with the self-determinationists. Yeah, I was with Cleveland, Bradford, and Dudley. I would have been on that side. But as I said, my mama was on the other side if I had listed her name. So, I have sentiments for both sides, but I definitely was among the self-determinationists. But as president of Oakwood, when that was going on, I did not count myself in amongst the presidents of the conferences who, that's what was being dealt with, conferences, not colleges. So I didn't include myself here at all. But if you want to know where I worked and where I helped and how I felt, the book will read the book. Read the book. You'll see me. I state myself in the last part of the book very clearly. The last 2 chapters, I state myself very clearly. Any other?
Thank you, Bobby Andrews. There was another one. Dr. Rochelle Parker wanted to clarify her statement earlier, and perhaps I misstated it, Dr. Parker, so my apologies. She says what she meant was not so much that the African Americans now had money and so they were willing to let them in, but rather she states it like this: they didn't want us to make black unions because of the money we bring.
Oh, now that may have been that may have been true, and many people felt that at that time. It really could have been. If so, it never surfaced. It never surfaced in anybody's writings that I know of or speeches, but many felt that it was an underlying variable of refusal. And it may have been, but I can't prove it.
Thank you for clarifying that, Dr. Parker. I appreciate that. I see there's another statement here, and perhaps it's Elder Adolphus Gurnett. Correct me if I'm wrong. It says, Dr. Rock, do you think the West Coast would benefit from joining the regional work? In other words, having a Black conference. And I know you touched on a little bit of that sentiment in your remarks just a few moments ago, but perhaps there's more to add to that.
I wouldn't say that, even if I thought it, because I have too many good friends who are presidents now, Black presidents, and my student at Oakwood, who I baptized when he was 14 in Detroit, Ricardo Graham, is president of this division. So even if I thought it, I wouldn't say it, because evidently they don't think so, and I would never say anything that would seem to be contrary to what they think and to what they're doing. I can only say to you that I applaud what they're doing. There was a time before we had a Black union president when I would say so, definitely. And before we had Black presidents of the local conferences. But I would not say so now because I have, as I've said, my students and my son in the ministry, who is the president of this union. And if he thought so and these others thought so, I think they'd be saying so if they thought it was a thing to go after. But evidently they don't think so, and I would never express an opinion that's contrary to what they're trying to do.
Thank you for that response, Dr. Rock. Dr. Higgs gives us an inquiry as well. Did the protests for Black unions have any impact on the election of the first Black North American Division president, which occurred about the same time?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I was at the meeting in 1978. I guess the meeting was called in late 77 when the nominating committee nominated Elder Bradford to be the president of the division. And it was a few months later in January of 1978 when he became the president by vote of the committee. So the Black Union debate began in 69, but the energies were begun earlier. And the first Black Union president was put in position at the Lake Union, Elder Robert Carter, in 1968. At the General Conference in 1975, in 1975, there was a plethora of Blacks who were placed in the division and in the General Conference. A lot of things happened. That debate broke open advances and opportunities for Blacks in the unions, in the division, and in the General Conference.
Thank you for that. Two other questions or inquiries. This comes from Darren again. He says, the question is, do we need or do we see the needs for the segregated churches and conferences now? That's quite
all right. My answer to that is there are no segregated churches and conferences. Where are there segregated churches and conferences? I don't know of any. Segregation is not practiced in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, in order to understand that, I must remind you that the opposite of segregation is not integration. The opposite of segregation is desegregation, and our church is desegregated. Because you have churches where everybody's Black or everybody's white, or one or two people are Black or one or two people are white, doesn't mean they're segregated. It just means their cultures have brought them together. Culture is the determining factor as to where people work and where people worship, pardon me. Is even a determinative factor as to how people marry. And cultural pull is what brings people together in communities. And segregation is what has produced the large Black ghettos and cultural demographic areas. Segregation produced Black culture. 250 years of slavery and 150 years of Jim Crow in Separate but Equal, and all of the rules of America have pushed us together in boundary maintaining mechanisms that have forced us to live together and forced us to develop our own culture and forced us to hang on to many of the cultures which we inherited from our African forefathers and foremothers. Segregation did that. And it's produced a culture that gives us a love for music and preaching that white people don't understand. We don't understand and appreciate what they do most of the time. And when I say that, I know that's an overstatement, but it's a general factor and the truth. So that I don't preach like a white preacher. And when I want my music for appeal, it isn't the appeal that a white preacher asks for. So people who hear me preach, now I preached in hundreds of white churches, but it's because I know where I am and I know they got to get out at 12 o'clock. So I try to handle the situation. I don't try to preach white, but there's some things I would say in a black pulpit I probably wouldn't say there. And so it's culture, folk, and the culture has said that you cannot put a white preacher in a black community. And remember, the pastor is not only pastor of the church, he or she is pastor of the community. And you put a white preacher in a black community, he doesn't know, it's an alien culture. So we need an indigenous preacher. And it's the indigenous preacher that has produced the high production that gives us the advance from 9% in 44 to 33% of the membership in North America today. And it's not separation. Separation says you can't come. Our black conferences have white churches. They have Portuguese churches. They have Spanish churches. They got all kinds. They have Filipino churches. It's not separation. It's not separation at all. It is, in fact, indigenous leadership, and it welcomes all people. Now, if the black conference has said, you white people can't come here, that's segregation. If the state conferences said, you black people can't come, that's segregation. But this is not segregation. This is desegregation. And the ability of anybody to worship in any church, to go to any hospital, to go to any school, that's desegregation. It's not segregation. So don't let anybody tell you that, because it's not true. Now, there may be some segregationists in the pile. You may find segregationist white people, and you don't want to be bothered. But even when you have white churches, one of the easiest way to get a black church, if you don't want to pay for it, is send a few hundred people over to the white church. Send a few hundred black people for every Sabbath for about a month. They'll leave that church and give it to you. But that doesn't mean that they are prejudiced. It just means that they're not comfortable. They don't speak the language. Culture is a language. And if you don't speak the cultural language, you go where it is spoken. And that is not segregation.
I appreciate your answer, your spirited answer, Dr. Rock. I've heard you reference in earlier discussions, years past now, you referenced Westminster Seventh-day Adventist Church and All Nations Seventh-day Adventist Church. And directly in response to when we get to heaven, we're all going to be worshiping there together. So why not start here? But you have referenced those specific congregations to demonstrate, along with Virginia, the church there with Elder Henry Wright, where they were all inclusive of a number of different ethnicities, but they have all changed now.
Well, yeah, and there's no harm in that. We shouldn't flagellate ourselves and beat ourselves up because black people want to worship where black people feel the spirit. That's okay. That's okay. And there are a lot of black people now who are becoming accustomed to white culture, so they join the nearest church near them, no matter what it is. That's fine. Let's us all. We are not what the founders of America thought about when they said we would be a melting pot and we put everybody in the same pot and we'd all be alike. We are a flower garden. Ellen White calls the nations and the ethnics a flower garden. We are a flower garden. Let the people who speak Chinese go to the Chinese church. Let the people who speak Spanish go to the Spanish church. And let black people who speak black go to the black church. Let them go. and be happy.
Well, you also made a comment that I clearly recall, where you said, yeah, it's true. We will all be worshiping there together in heaven. It also says in the scripture that there will be no marriage and giving in marriage in heaven as well. But I don't see anybody starting that down here either.
Well, yes, people, I used to say that. People said, well, there'll be no black churches in heaven. And my answer is always, no, there won't be any marriage in heaven. So, you know, we're not going to break up marriages on earth. But the point, the better way to put it, I think, is simply there will be no separate cultures in heaven. There are not going to be any separate languages. There are not going to be any Spanish churches in heaven. There are not going to be any Russian churches in heaven. There's only going to be one culture.
Yeah.
We're still suffering from cultural division down here, and we have to work to save these black people in these black cities.
Amen. Amen.
And that's what regional conference is about, and that's what the regional coordinator is about on the West Coast. The regional coordinator does the same thing a black conference does, only they don't have presidents, they have coordinators.
I'll take these last few comments, mindful of the time, and then we'll conclude. And Dr. Rock, if you're willing, we'll tackle retirement next week. If you're willing, that topic, it's up to you. But I know we haven't even touched on that. Let's take this last couple of ones. Renee says, white Seventh-day Adventist pastors in Michigan, as of last summer at least, are still being instructed by their conference leaders at a pastor's conference that their job is not to address Black Lives Matter and other injustices. Their job is just to spread the three angels message.
All right, I'm going to make a deal with you. I will cover that question next week when I cover retirement. That question has to do with the Adventist, the social conservatism of Seventh-day Adventists, and how it happens that the Adventist church, my church, which I love, preached for 50 years as a pastor, retired, and tomorrow, well, I'm not going to go into tomorrow, but I'll just say I've been around a long time, and I can tell you that my church leadership, not everybody in it, but the leadership and most of the members, and a lot of even black people, do not believe that social justice is a part of the three angels message. They don't believe that social justice is a part of the three angels message. It's something you might do by yourself, but it's not a part of the three angels message. So next week, since you put
that, Renee also said, and I would be remiss if I did not conclude her thought. It simply says this: does this indicate, and you touched on it a little bit, does this indicate that these church leaders are teaching and directing contrary to the current official Seventh-day Adventist position? And is there any accountability in terms of the General Conference on matters like these? And perhaps that's something, I don't know if you want to answer any further to that, or if what you've said is sufficient.
Tune in next week.
There you go.
Tune in next week for retirement, why the Black brothers got their own retirement system, which is wonderful. It gives them about $1,000 more a month than I make. I retired on the GC policy, but the Black brothers have their own retirement. I'll tell you about that, and we'll talk about social justice and the Adventist policy and practice.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rock. I want you to know your cousin Carolyn says, thank you for this historical lesson that you provided. That's Carolyn. And then all of you I know will join me in just saying, and it's here listed, and so I don't want to ignore it. Comes from a dear friend, but you've got a number of folks who have indicated that they know that tomorrow is your birthday. And so on the chat, starting with your cousin, she says, happy birthday.
Thank you.
And I know that Hatchet Mitchell, happy birthday. Dr. Rochelle Parker, Renee is indicating, but a myriad and Charlene, a myriad and a host of individuals, I'm sure, echo the same sentiment.
Thank you.
We all want to express that tomorrow is Dr. Rock's birthday.
you.
We want to just say happy
Thank
birthday to you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for that. And I didn't start this, Uncle Calvin. It wasn't me. I don't know who started it, but happy birthday.
Well, thank you. Thank you. And I'll see you next week. I want to talk about retirement and social justice, Black Lives Matter, and
Yes.
all of that, and the Adventist Church. All right?
Yes, absolutely. So let's
Thank
pause.
you.
Let's pause and just have prayer for Dr. Rock. I thank you, all of you. I know that I see you there. Would you mind offering a word of prayer for our guest of honor, and then we'll conclude his time.
Okay, certainly. Let's pray. Father God, in the name of Jesus and by the authority of his resurrection power, we gather together your children on this Sabbath with thanksgiving, just for the privilege we have to know you in the pardon of our sins. What a wonderful God you are. You've been so kind to us. We've gone through this year of COVID. We've lost friends and loved ones, Father, but you saw fit to keep us here. And we thank you for this gathering. Thank you for Debbie and this ministry that she has launched during this season of COVID. Thank you for Dr. Rock and the many years of life that you've given him. I do believe it's 91. I'm not sure, but we
91.
thank you.
Yes, 91.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, God, for what you've done for him. And thank you for Sharon, who is sharing life with him right now. You've been a wonderful God. Thank you for the history that he provides and for the experience and for the example that he has provided all of us all these years. Thank you so much. Bless each one, each family that's represented, each marriage. Bless our health and keep us safe, Lord. And more than anything, we want to be ready when you come. And so we ask you to anoint us afresh with your spirit. We pray this in the name of Jesus and for his sake. Amen.
Thank you for joining us once again. It has been so nice to have this time of fellowship with you. May the Lord bless and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and grant you and yours peace. Until then, take care of yourselves and each other. For more information about this program, This Is My Story, Testimonies That Move the Soul, see us at our website. We look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.